Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to Social Value Matters 2020. My name is Charlotte, and I will be your MC and tech support for this session. So Social Value Matters, which is this conference, has been organized by Social Value Canada and Social Value International, a part of our annual conference series. The idea was to keep this event in real life in Toronto, but like everything else in 2020, things changed and here we are. Social Value International is a global network and we work with social value and impact measurement. Over the last 6 months, we have really, all of us together, learned the importance of what we do and why that is something that we need to keep on focusing on. And we are thrilled to be involved in this conference and having these fantastic speakers attending as well. So the session that you're now attending is part of our incredible practitioners conversation, and we hope that you'll enjoy it. But before I hand over to Bonnie, who will be facilitating these discussions, just some basic housekeeping. So number one, the session is being recorded and the recording will be available for replay for those who have bought tickets for full access, and it will be available later today. Secondly, please do use the chat box to introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're from, and also if you have any questions or comments throughout the session, put them in there and I'll have a look and I'll let the speakers know as well. And now, time to hand over to Bonnie. Enjoy the session and thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for dialing in today on the Friday. So our discussion today is measuring systems change in a post-COVID world. I think we all know that with COVID-19 outbreak, we're seeing a lot of the systemic challenges that our planet and societies faces. And impact practitioners often have grappled with the challenge of measuring systems change because of its fluid nature and complexity. So I'm really thrilled to be including practitioners across the world today in our call who've been working to measure systems change. So I'm the moderator for today. I'm Bonnie Chiu. I'm the Managing Director of the Social Investment Consultancy. We are actually a strategic partner of Social Value UK. So we've been in the space around impact measurement for a while, and system change has been something that we've been thinking a lot about, and this year have been working on ways how we can better measure systems change. So I'll introduce our panelists shortly, but they will soon be talking a bit more about themselves and why they've come to the conversation today. So I'll start with Dr. Jip Walker. Thanks so much again for waking up early to join us today. He's based in Washington, D.C. It's currently 4:20 a.m. in D.C. Chip is a senior policy analyst in the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning at the U.S. Agency for International Development, also known as USAID. And he is currently leading efforts to implement the local systems framework, which he will tell us more about. I came across Chip because I was really fascinated by his local systems framework, and I just emailed him one day, and he very kindly replied my email, and that's how we've started our conversation. Next up, we have Nota Tuselo. She's calling in from South Africa. She's a social investment analyst at the social investor Shikululu, and she has a lot of experience working across education, health, climate, and she manages a portfolio of community development projects across South Africa. And final, last but not least, with Antonia Orr. She's the Chief Executive of Coalition for Efficiency. She's also based in the UK. Coalition for Efficiency has a what they call the measuring the good approach, working primarily with small organizations to use data for learning and improvement. But prior to this, she's also helped launch and grow the Global Social Entrepreneurship Network at Unlimited. And she previously lived in Mexico. So I think we'll have a lot of case studies from across the world, and what hopefully will be a very engaging conversation with people in the room today as well. So I will now pose the first question to the panelists. Why do we need to talk about systems change? I'll ask Chip to start.
Well, hello everyone, and good morning from an early Washington, D.C. I mean, I think that we don't have to look very far to see a very complex world that is dealing with a lot of changes, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about dealing with this global pandemic, or here in the United States with issues of social justice, to realize that these are very difficult problems, but also problems that arise from the involvement and engagement of lots of different actors. And anytime you have situations where organizations, individuals come together, you're dealing with systems. And so it just seems that increasingly the problems that we face are of this sort, and that the way that we need to address them is not with our traditional methods, but by adopting tools, techniques, and approaches that are appropriate for dealing with these complex problems, and understanding that the results that we have are not within any one organization's or group's control, but because we have to work together to solve them. And that's what systems thinking and systems practice is all about.
Thanks so much. Dr. Tizello, would you like to go next on just why we need to talk about systems change?
Sure. So for me, I think it's just echoing a lot of what Chip said, but considering the complexity of the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve today, we can't have a linear approach to it. And I think we've worked at it in a very linear way for a long time. And we're now seeing that there's just too many intersectional kind of issues that need a different approach. And so I think from our experience, that systems change has been effective in helping us to think broadly and more diverse thinking or approaches to how we solve problems around social development and social investment. And so it just kind of is an effective way for us to really start thinking about how we solve problems and how we involve every possible actor in being a part of solving those problems. And that's what systems change, in my perspective, into perspective, yeah.
Thank you. Antonia.
Hi, and thank you, Bonnie, for bringing us all together. Morning, everyone. So just to add to what the other speakers have said, I think what I would say is that we need to recognise that there are a lot of grassroots organisations that have already been working systemically for many years and for many decades, but haven't necessarily benefited from certain tools and approaches that the systems change field can offer. And given the complexity of the problems that we're facing at the moment, the unhealthy systems that we're trying to intervene in, I think that, why do we need to talk about systems change? Because there are some really valuable tools and approaches that we can bring in to sort of support change makers and grassroots organisations on the ground. With the caveat that I think we need to be careful to make sure that it's an inclusive approach as well, because I think that sort of traditionally systems change could be described as quite a sort of white Western academic approach in terms of its roots. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's not to say that the tools and approaches can't be incredibly useful. I think for me personally, what I find quite exciting about sort of the systems change field of practice is the leadership behaviours that it encourages, and recognizing that we need different styles of leadership to take bold action, and that's fostering things like humility, listening, collaborating, those sorts of qualities. And if we're really going to tackle these huge, very complex problems, then we need to bring that into our organizations.
Wow, thank you so much. That's been a really helpful starting point that you touch upon from just a need for systems change given the complexity of the world we live in, to practically how you can expand your way of thinking in looking at your funding, looking at your portfolio, and also to model new kinds of leadership behavior. So that's really helpful. I think before we delve into a deeper conversation, I'll just like to set the scene a little bit, and Chip already shared a link to a list of systems thinking resources that he's compiled. But just to set the the scene a little bit. I mean, what is a system? And some of the keywords I've heard so far from our panelists include complexity, fluidity, not linear. So complex systems are basically a configuration of interacting independent parts connected through a web of relationships that represent a whole greater than the sum of the parts. So we have some graphs here, you know, the fuzzy, how fuzzy the borders are in a soft system and in a hard system. It's more well defined, but actually how do we define those boundaries? And that's one of the things that I'm sure we'll talk a bit about when we come to how to measure systems change. But complex systems exhibit behaviors like self-organization, non-linearity, feedback loop, self-organization again, and emergence. So these are just some setting the scene what a system is, but just the definition of a system is already quite debated, and we can get more into it. But you know, just to say that these definitions are not the only definitions that exist. And then why systems change, I think our panelists have already touched upon that. I would just add that when you think about social impact, and we talk a lot about sustainability of the social change programs, actually system change would help bring about lasting change by altering the underlying structures. So in a way, if you think about the efficacy of social change efforts, having a system change lens does lend ourselves to increasing sustainability of any interventions. There's also a view that system change can help tackle root causes and therefore bring about lasting change. So I would just kind of wanted to set those definitions, and then we'll launch a poll now so that we can understand a bit more where you are at in your journey in systems change in order to frame our conversation a bit better for you. Could you pull up the poll, please?
Of course, the poll has been launched. I hope you can all see it on your screen. And I can see some votings are coming through, so I'll leave that poll open for another 30 seconds or until I see that everyone voted. Perfect, everyone has voted, so we'll end the poll and share the results. So the results are on how would you rate your understanding of systems change? I don't know anything at all, which said 18%. I know a little bit, 36%. I know a fair bit, 9%. I know quite a lot, 27%. I consider myself an expert. Humble brag is allowed, 9%.
I think the panelists could vote in this case, so maybe the 9% came from someone else. But that's great. We do have a broad segment in terms of understanding. So it would be great if we can now jump into how do we begin to measure systems change. Chip, would you like to start with the 5 hours framework and any framing remarks? Because you have definitely been doing this for the longest time out of our panel. You need to unmute. Thank you.
I'm going to share a slide here. Okay. One of the first questions, if you are engaged in sort of trying to support systems change, right? I think that one of the very first questions that you have to answer is if you have to understand the system that you're working in, you want to see changes within that system. And so to know that the efforts, the interventions that you are making are actually having the desired effects and helping to move the system in the direction that you want it to move to have better results. And so this question of measurement comes up all the time. It is a persistent and sort of central question that systems practitioners grapple with, in part because this idea of a system is actually a mental construct that we all have, that we essentially adopt in our own heads to try to make sense of these complex phenomena that we have around us. And so it isn't something where you can actually go out and take a tape measure and go out and sort of measure something, because these are all sort of a logical sort of understanding that you have and that I need to share with you in order to sort of make some collective sense of the system, and then also to be able to measure the change. But anyway, what we talk about when we go through it is that in order to sort of get to the point where you can actually measure whether or not a system is changing, there's some steps that you need to go through in order to get there. So, for example, the first thing that you need to do is to sort of basically saying, well, what is the problem that I'm trying to address? Is it a local community-based problem with waste disposal? Is it a national level problem? We're dealing with environmental practices? Is it a global problem dealing with a pandemic? And you sort of need to try to figure out, and then, as we say in our language, to bound the system, to essentially sort of say, well, where are the boundaries? Because we need to define what is. Could I ask everybody to put yourselves on mute, please? Who and what is inside the system, what organizations, what individuals, what connections are inside and what are outside. Because you need those to be able to bound the system. The next thing that you really need to do before you can even get into the measurement question is that you need to sort of understand how that system is working as it currently is. One of the advantages with systems thinking is that it really is attuned to picking up dynamic relationships. So these things are not characterized necessarily in terms of rigid cause and effect, but in terms of sort of dynamic patterns that exist, and the results you see are through ongoing and consistent interactions. So you need to try to identify them, and there are a whole set of tools that systems practitioners can bring to bear to better understand and capture those dynamics. And then, like almost all other parts of sort of social change practice, you do need to develop a theory of change. In other words, how do you think that the interventions that you may be able to bring to bear are able to sort of change those dynamics in specific ways in order to bring about the change that you're seeking? And you sort of basically have to answer those basic questions in order to have sort of an understanding of how you're going to proceed. And one of the concepts that we use a lot in systems thinking is looking for what we call leverage points. These are essentially based on our examination of the system, where we think we may be able to spark some change. And we can get into discussion later on about what those look like. But we're looking for sort of like key places where we can, as the name suggests, where we can get some greater effect on the system and begin perhaps to use tipping points or other sorts of things to begin to get broader change from those initial efforts. And then finally, when you sort of got your theory of change and you sort of have an understanding of what you're going to do, then you can then the trick is essentially looking for those key changes that seem to be necessary, at least initially, in order to bring about the change. And those then become essentially the things that you really want to focus your measurement strategy on, or your monitoring strategy. And in order for doing this, it does help to have some kind of a framework to sort of help guide you through this process. And what Bonnie was referring to earlier is a particular framework that we have developed at USA, which we call the 5 R's, which I can go into in greater detail if there are some questions in the Q&A. And we also have a longer little pamphlet that describes the 5 R's, and that's one of the resources that's located, that's in that list that I put into the chat earlier. But essentially, what we're saying is that you can understand any system, human-based system primarily, through an understanding of these sort of stylized characteristics of a system. And essentially, that's what's captured here, and they can be identified in these 5 R's. So any system is going to have some kind of an input, which we call resources. There's going to be some sort of a transformation process, and then there's going to be some output that comes out of it, which we call results. And in most of these systems that we're talking about, because they are what are called open systems, there's a feedback loop. In other words, whatever happens has an impact on what happens today is going to have an impact on how things happen tomorrow. And so there is this feedback loop. And then the rest of the model is essentially the processes of how that transformation occurs. So we believe in these systems that you have actors, individuals or organizations, but these actors what's important about them is that they can play multiple roles. So in other words, a large organization, for example, a government ministry may actually give out grants, but it also may enforce regulations. Those are 2 different roles, and it's often important to distinguish the 2. So we have actors who play roles, and they interact with lots of other actors through a set of relationships. And all of this is governed by a set of rules. So any system, I would argue, we can characterize in terms of these 5 R's, the resources, rules, roles, relationships, and results. But also, you can use this as a convenient framework to identify what those key changes are. In other words, do you need to make changes in the resources? Do you need to make rule changes? Are there roles, for example, that are not being performed particularly well, where it's important perhaps to improve the capabilities of particular organizations to perform those roles? Are there, for example, relationships that are missing or that need to be built in order to achieve those particular kinds of results? And when you can start to disentangle this whole systems problem and break it down to these smaller key relationships, it becomes a lot easier to identify what are the methods that may be available to measure whether change is actually happening. And a lot of these rely on more traditional monitoring and evaluation techniques, but you can also bring some systems type tools to bear and just use them repeatedly to monitor whether there's change actually happening. But the basic point is that one of the things when you talk about the systems change is it's so daunting because it seems so large, and what it's suggesting is that you can, through this process of understanding the system and sort of understanding what the critical changes are needed, that you can make it a much more sort of manageable problem. And we will perhaps come back to it, but we have had some experience actually applying this particular framework to monitoring systems change in some of our USAID funded projects around the world.
Thanks so much, Chip. That's really, really helpful. Can I turn to Northern Giselo? We've actually been playing with Chip's 5 R's framework, and maybe you can share some of the things that you've been doing in the past few months around systems change and impact measurement.
Yeah, so it's been really effective actually as a start to helping us map out our theory of change as an organization. So at Chikululu, looking at how we are structuring our theory of change to answer specifically to the systems in which we work, right? And it's been useful for that, first of all, but also in looking at the different ways that the 5 R's can fit into our structure and also our monitoring and evaluation frameworks, right? So as Chip has advised that, it's best to start with the framework or to have a framework. So we've been building specifically around that, building our own frameworks internally, but also then integrating it even into our advisory work, where we are supporting our clients as well to think about it in that same instance, right? And instead of just building a theory of change around, you know, maybe the big goals that you have, wider goals that you want to have around impact, but rather thinking more systematically around the community and all of the impact drivers within that, those communities, as well as looking at the relationships, especially with a lot of our work. We have, you know, diverse kind of systems, especially around smaller communities and rural communities, where governments are a huge player in terms of what will happen as far as impact is driven. So looking at municipal support, looking at government support, and then also looking at then the funders themselves and how they play within that entire system, and also the perceptions that the community has of the funder and the work that we want to do in those communities. So it's kind of helped us to really think wholly around the impact that we want to see, but also how we measure it. So it's just, we've built then a lot of metrics around that, and how we're measuring that, the work that we do, how we're measuring our impact, but also then looking at, you know, the different relationships and the roles and the structures that we are wanting to essentially leave behind once, you know, we say we're done, basically, or once there's exits, or once the work starts to progress, that we're seeing then effective change that's happening in those communities. And so that's how we're able to structure our impact thinking as well. And also it's just kind of helping us to think through a lot of our impact investing understanding as well. So it's just kind of looking at, as we are stepping into that field as well of impact investing, how we are going to structure our the measurement of impact. And so, you know, a lot of thought and a lot of work is going into impact investing and how impact is measured in the first place, and to ensure that there's no impact washing, to make sure that there's no that there's actual, you know, tangible change that a community or whoever the beneficiaries are see, right, towards at the end of a program, at the end of a structured approach. And so we've been able to see that happening through, and so kind of structuring around that to make sure that that happens as we begin that process of our work around impact investing. So it's helped us to structure a lot of that, but really there's a lot, especially around building our metrics and our monitoring and evaluation metrics, especially to structure them accordingly to how we can then integrate systems thinking continuously in the process, and not just at the beginning or at the end, but consistently throughout. Yeah.
Thanks so much. And I know Antonia wants to come in with some further considerations around measuring systems.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, just on that last point, that idea that the sort of within sort of systems thinking and systems change itself, learning is absolutely baked into that process, and you're constantly, and that need for an agile mindset as well, to constantly be sort of learning, adapting as you go. I think for me, and I'm sorry if I'm bringing more questions than answers to this, and I'm learning as well, but from my perspective of supporting small organisations at the moment, specifically in the UK, but also in the past in Latin America. So, you know, the hundreds of thousands of grassroots organisations, leaders, small charities in the UK, is just thinking that there's a real lack of knowledge around systems change, and also around impact measurement as well. And a real need to, if we want to get everyone involved and all the key actors in the systems involved in learning, then there's a real need to sort of build capacity, build confidence, break down barriers around language. So I think that's a real challenge, because we want people and actors and organisations at every level within the system to be on the same page and to be learning together. And I also, I think that there's a need for a more of a kind of coaching approach versus sort of consultancy approach, so that organizations, initiatives are kind of learning and building the skills as they go. And you know, some of these frameworks and tools can be quite complicated to get your head around. And there are also the limitations around cost as well. So not just to fund training around understanding sort of new concepts and new frameworks, but also the time it takes to really properly build in reflection within sort of systems change initiatives. And can we get more funders on board to support that peer learning, convening, bringing different system actors together, and to really sort of dive into sort of proper different types of evaluation and exploring that. Anyways, that was just sort of something important points I want to consider, but I want to leave time for the Q&A.
Thank you, Antonia. So we'll see if there's any question from the floor. Otherwise, I do have a question just around more practical examples, particular contexts within which this methodology might work well. But yes, any questions from the audience?
In the chat, we have not had any questions yet, but also if anyone has a question, you can unmute yourself now and speak as well. Seems like it's been crystal clear.
I wondered, Chip, could you share any examples whereby you've implemented the 5 hours framework and it's worked quite well?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. But if I may, I'd like to just pick up on 2 points that Antonia made before I do that. I mean, I think that, you know, and sort of back to the initial question about sort of why systems approaches. One of the concepts, again, that's sort of often used in sort of systems conversations is this concept of mental models, right? So, I mean, the mental models are essentially the set of lenses most of the time that we're completely unaware of that we use to help make sense of and organize the world. And we apply these mental models on all sorts of things, but the one that's really kind of important for us is what are your mental models about how change happens in societies, right? And if you go to a graduate program and so forth, and what they will pull out is, you know, change that is often very much based upon technical solutions, improving, you know, getting some new technology, getting a new process involved. It tends to be a singular solution, oftentimes called a solution that is expected to sort of have a broad impact on the broader society. That is one mental model of how change happens, and it's actually the mental model that most people carry around in their heads most of the time. If you look right now, for example, at the way in which the world is trying to address the pandemic, what's the answer? It's a vaccine. The assumption is that the vaccine all of its on own is going to somehow transform the answer. Now, occasionally they'll start talking about how they get it out and how they distribute it and so forth, but that's beginning to realizing that it's not just simply a vaccine that's an issue, it's a whole set of related things, and now we're beginning to start thinking about it as a system. But most people who are involved in social change understand that it is, you know, it's an inherently complex and political process of trying to get people together to solve problems together. And to point to the point that Antonia was making, you know, it requires a different kind of understanding about who you need to work with and how you need to work with to try to solve problems. And so that's a different mental model. And that is, I think, where fundamentally there's a difference between systems approaches on the one hand and the more traditional technical ones on the other. And I think what really sets it apart. And so all of this sort of systems thinking and the tools and all the rest of it are all supposed to be essentially just aids to help you do that more effectively. And it doesn't have to be complex, right? I mean, the point is that there's a set of approaches within system thinking called participatory systems mapping, which can be done on a dirt floor with sticks. I've seen it done, where you essentially are just trying to help local people describe and visualize with the nature of the problem as they see it, right? And all you need to do is sort of explain to them that, you know, you have relationships that you can put up with arrows and issues and so forth that you can put in boxes, and then you can pretty well do a sort of a sophisticated mapping. And that's, for example, we have a really good example of how that was applied to try to address some issues of a fairly severe drug abuse problem in provinces in northern Myanmar. And so it was actually talking to the community itself about how they could address it, and they used some of those participatory mapping processes to address those problems. But we've also, they didn't actually use the 5 R's in that particular case, but we have, for example, used the 5 R's. One of our missions, our programs in Honduras has been very effective in using this across a number of sectors to try to identify. We have work on agriculture to sort of identify which crops seem to be, and which cropping systems seem to be the most amenable to improvement and change, to sort of understand those dynamics using the 5 R's. We've looked at, the same thing has been used for municipal waste programs in 4 cities, and then a similar effort on in other smaller towns on how to improve the services that are provided to individuals who are being returned, who have unsuccessfully migrated and who are being brought back to Honduras. So we have a number of applications, and we've used it in different languages. And one of the things I think people like about the 5 R's is that it's a relatively simple framework to understand. It can be translated into other languages as we have done it. And it does actually carry. I mean, it does apply in other settings. And so that's, I think, its principal utility, is that it just helps, I think, give you some simple language to talk about a pretty complicated problem.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for highlighting participatory systems mapping. We had a session yesterday about participatory evaluation and inclusive evaluation. And so this chimes in quite well. It's not either or, it's actually how all these methodologies can come together to provide a more holistic way of looking at social issues. Yeah, any other questions from the floor, if other panelists want to jump in?
So Social Value UK here again. No questions in the chat. So if anyone wants to ask anything, trying to unmute yourself and ask those questions.
I might just share something that I sort of discovered this week when I was just doing some more research, because when we were chatting about this last week, I was really sort of starting to see more and more parallels between sort of systems change practice and sort of intersectional feminist practice and approaches. And there, I just, from my own experience of working in a women's rights fund in Mexico, before they weren't using systems change theories and models, but they were practicing a lot of those sorts of behaviours that we're now seeing and that we're now encouraging. And I stumbled across a really interesting report that was just published in September, which I'll share with you for anyone who's interested in looking at that in a bit more detail about how the different fields can learn from each other, and kind of practical ways that sort of funders, consultants, evaluators can support grassroots organisations, but this is with a sort of gender equity lens. So I've just shared the link in the chat for anyone who wants to look at that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and I think I'd just like to add that, you know, thinking about intersectionality again, that it's just the 5 R's framework is useful to help understand the various intersections that maybe a specific person would have to deal with. And so also in trying to problem solve, or even when we think about design structures, right, that it's useful in helping to diversify our thinking and also get input from diverse voices, and not just from one specific person or one specific type of person or type of organization or type of actor, right? But that we're looking at every possible point of intersection that a community is facing. So if we're looking at, you know, climate change, for example, and supporting that community around those issues, then we're looking at the various ways that, how does it impact children? How does it impact the parents? How does it impact whether or not people have work in the next 10 years, that kind of thing, right? As opposed to just kind of looking at it from one perspective of, this community needs to be, I don't know, relocated, for example, because there's just, the environment is just not conducive for them to continue to live there. But looking at it in a different way, as opposed to just wanting to solve the one perspective of an issue, but then, you know, because in a lot of ways that social issues and social difficulties that people are facing are very much intersectional, and they're not just kind of one-dimensional. So looking at all of the different ways that the 5 R's apply to it have been useful in helping to make sure that those kinds of different ways that that people are affected by different things like COVID have been useful to identify that and help us to think through that as well. So I think in that context, it's been useful for us, even in rural spaces as well, where a lot of us actually just don't have that perspective of living under those kinds of conditions, that it's helped us to think through those kinds of frameworks and how we structure impacts around that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I would now like to ask a question. You know, I think we've talked a lot about how in the planning stage that actually 5 R's framework and systems thinking is really helpful, and also using systems thinking throughout program development to always make sure we are actually tackling some of the underlying issues and that we're creating more sustainable change. But I wonder if we've seen concrete examples of system change evaluation being done. And maybe Chip, I don't know if USAID or if you've seen funders commission evaluations done in a systems manner. Or maybe that's an area to really develop more practice around.
The short answer to your question is probably no. I mean, at this point, we're spending most of our effort at just trying to design and now increasingly implement our projects with through a systems lens, if you will. And the reason that USAID, for example, has sort of gravitated towards the systems thinking has been primarily to address this persistent problem of the fact that we provide resources, we run projects, and then find that those projects don't have a lasting impact on what's on the issues. And so we've sort of said, well, what's causing the problem? And the problem is basically that we haven't been addressed. We've been taking that traditional kind of, well, all we need to do is increase like crop yields, and that will solve the nutrition problem. When in fact it's much more complex than that. And so what we've been doing is in the evaluation field has been trying to encourage people to at least start doing what we call ex post evaluation. So that means to sort of come back to a project area several years after and see to what extent the changes have actually stuck, if you will. I mean, the results sometimes aren't pretty, and that's, I think, one of the reasons that makes it hard to do it. But it's, there are a whole set of other incentives that make it difficult for organizations, even us, to sort of do those kinds of evaluations. But I think they are really important, and when they have been done, I think it has been very revealing to the organizations to sort of look at their practices, because there's a lot that can be done, and a lot that can be done during the implementation phase to set it up more effectively for longer term change. And a lot of, it's not only about the systems, it's about other kinds of management practices and how you engage with the local actors, the people who will actually be there and take on responsibility. So yeah, so ex post evaluation is important.
Great, thanks so much. There was more questions now. I think we're getting warmed up after 45 minutes into a conversation. So there was one from Ajani based in Mumbai who asked if governments or politicians, particularly in developing economies, understand the complexities of system and relationships, and how can we do more to build their capacity. So that's one question. Yes, and I think a linked question from Ajani as well, which is more theoretical, but there was this issue around defining the boundary, and this is I think one of the areas that I still struggle with, how we define the boundary. He said that the root cause of the systemic problem is sometimes outside the boundary of influence. COVID as an example, how can we address that? I wonder, I'll just let the panelists decide who wants to jump in.
I can have a start. I think this is very much a lot of what we have to deal with, actually, what the question around governments and politicians, because often they have their own agenda and essentially just sort of want to leverage that for seeing their own kind of that agenda advanced, right? And this is kind of looking at a very pessimistic view. But so what we've often found is that looking at especially developing economies and, which is South Africa is that the complexities aren't always understood. And that's not because there isn't kind of an intrinsic understanding, but it's just not from that perspective. There's no one who's really kind of wanting to work at it from that perspective, but rather it's just seeing, okay, that there's a problem that needs to be solved now and we must solve it. And so I think that's where, as practitioners, that we come in to then help develop that thinking and to help kind of direct solutions around that thinking, right? That as we come in as solution makers, or as we come in to design solutions, that we're helping them think through that from that perspective. And kind of bring in the importance of it. And it's not to say that we're telling them what to do, but really, again, which is why the 5 R's are so useful, is that they help us to just kind of hear their perspective. And then it doesn't even have to be like a structured way of saying we're doing now the 5 R's framework and we're telling them this is the 5 R's framework and we want you to follow it, right? But we are just, it's kind of structuring any sort of interaction around knowing the answers that we want to get. And so making sure that we're asking the right questions of them so that they can then be a part of the solution, as opposed to just kind of where often it's been that they've been impediments to the process. So I think that, and then in terms of capacity building, we're doing a lot of work around that, but it's mainly, it's focused on ensuring that we are kind of, it's a partnership process, right? So we're partnering with the municipality as we come into a specific community, as opposed to coming in, fixing things, trying to fix things, and then bringing in the municipality to sort of take over, right? So that's the best way that we found that capacity building has been effective, but also involving grassroots, community-based organizations into the entire process, because they often are the biggest connects to even government structures in the communities, because they've done that work on the ground. So just from that perspective, that's kind of what we have seen on our end.
Great. Can I ask Chip about the root cause issue outside the boundary, and also how do you adapt to the changing nature of the system as well? Can you do it in real time, for example? How do you update that system change framework as things change?
Oh, thanks. Give me the easy questions. But these two questions, I think, go to some of the real challenges. Once you sort of take on or adopt a sort of systems perspective, I think this question around bounding problems, and on the one hand, and then dealing with the inherent dynamism of the systems on the other, are two ongoing challenges. And the answer to it is that there isn't a simple answer to either of those. with respect to the boundary issue, it is, I think, it is a tricky thing to do. It is a necessary thing to do because one of the sort of throwaway criticisms of systems is, well, oh, everything's related to everything. So, this is a theory of everything, and the answer to that is, well, perhaps, but that's not helpful. And so the question is, can we bring it down to a level where we actually have some ability to address it and think about it? But it is a tricky question. So for example, with COVID, yes, it clearly is global in terms of its scope. But the question is, does it make sense? Can it be usefully addressed at some smaller scale, right? At a national scale, or here in the United States at a state level scale, where the issue, but it's all related to what the nature of the problem is that you're trying to address. The other thing I think it's important to recognize is that systems are actually embedded in other systems, right? So, for example, with respect to COVID, the dynamics of what's happening in my particular community is embedded in the dynamics that is happening in the state that I happen to live in, and then further embedded in the United States. And so, there are these sort of levels of these problems. And the question is then, is it still, even though I understand that there are these other dynamics that are happening at deeper levels, can I actually sort of focus on this question locally? So for example, we're having a discussion right now in this community where I live about when is it going to be safe to open up schools? Well, to some extent that has to do with national policy, but on the other hand, it's also reflective of what's happening in my community. So I think it is useful for us to sort of think about the dynamics locally here to try to address that problem. But it is an issue, and there's no simple thing about it. And that is actually, when you do systems mapping and so forth, one of the questions that you're trying to answer is, how far is enough? And when is it useful to stop? As far as the dynamism is concerned, I think this is, a real challenge. Some of the tools that have been developed, particularly things like some of these modeling efforts, are intended to try to capture those changes. So actually, for example, weather forecasters use systems models to make daily weather forecasts, so they can capture change relatively quickly. If you happen to have that kind of data, you can do that kind of systems analysis. But I think what you need to be doing, and we have methods available to us, is to sort of look at what parts of the system you expect to change, and can you develop simple kinds of indicators to know whether the change is happening. They're sometimes called sentinel indicators, sort of help you keep track of sort of the changes that are really, really critical. So everybody, for example, right now is sort of focused on, at least here in the United States, on how many cases are emerging every day, and we get data reports every day on COVID cases, and so that's a sort of a signal as to whether or not how the system is moving. That's the kind of thing that you need to develop.
Great, thanks so much. And I think that also links to the participatory question around if there's a way where you can connect stakeholders to do participatory system mapping, and if they feel invested in this process, then they can also be the ones updating the framework. And there are technological solutions now that will enable us to do that. I know we're running out of time. I would just want to highlight that for me and at the Social Investment Consultancy, we're really trying to think about how we can evaluate systems change. So we're working quite closely with Shikululu as they are developing their systems change framework, evaluation framework, and hopefully we can have some more concrete examples to show as we continue to work together on this. And it sounds like, yeah, there's still a lot of unanswered methodological questions, but we have to, I guess, start with trying. I just want to wrap up and ask Antonia if you have 1 or 2 minutes of last question, and then, or last, maybe not question, or remarks rather, and then I'll ask the other panelists to wrap up so we can do our last poll and then send everyone off to their Friday.
Great, yeah, thanks, Bonnie. And I'm sort of so grateful to have the other two speakers here with their really kind of sort of practical experience and able to share that. I think that one aspect for me that I picked up on the very beginning is this this sort of need both to sort of build capacity building at different levels, whether it's at government level, grassroots level, but there's this idea about developing different styles of leadership. And how can we go about doing that and kind of creating those spaces? I just think it's worth mentioning there are some initiatives, certainly in the UK, that are starting to think about this and build those different styles. So there's She Leads Change, which was born out of the School of Systems Change, which Forum for the Future is sort of incubated. And I think they're taking on a very different approach to building kind of bold, authentic leaders and giving them the sort of capacity and capabilities to take on these challenges. So yeah, that's sort of something I'm interested in carrying on exploring, maybe working with Bonnie and others and thinking, how can we support, you know, the bulk of the civil society organisations in the UK are very small, and often they are very much intervening at that systems level, but might not have the sort of the tools and deep understanding to take that further and evaluate it and share that. So I'm kind of looking forward to exploring that area much more.
Thank you. And I think if we make that a success in the voluntary sector, we can roll that out to the politicians, as we said earlier in this meeting. Noticello, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I just think that it's kind of fairly new to all of us, systems thinking, and I think it's the nature of anything that disrupts what we're used to, is that there's a lot of questions, more than there are answers sometimes, but we found it really useful to just kind of grind through those questions and just work through those questions and figure out how we can answer them on our own terms, I guess, and not just kind of trying to figure out what somebody else has said about it, but to define it for ourselves. And I think especially with the kind of context that we have in South Africa, that's very necessary, that we're not just trying to apply what somebody else has sort of done and see if it can work here, but defining it for ourselves, even with kind of the framework that is provided. So I think it's just kind of being bold enough to work through it and not be stopped by the questions that it brings up, but to just work through it and figure out how we can work for your context. And for our context, it's been really useful to help us define a lot of problems in a different way, but also design differently and think through our design practices differently. So I think it's worth kind of digging deeper into it to see how it works for you. Yeah.
And Chip, yeah, last 1 minute.
Well, I've spoken a lot. I just want to thank the opportunity to engage with folks about this issue. Personally, I'm just gratified anytime I can find other people who are working across the globe trying to bring these issues to bear. So the work that you're doing in South Africa is just really exciting. But I just want to also say that we still, in the world of systems and systems thinking, that is still very much a minority view, and even within my agency, it still is a minority view. And I think that we just need to continue to build out across different sectors and in different areas this orientation about how we do problem solving, because as we started off this talk, the issues that the globe is confronting right now definitely need these systems approaches if we have any hope of trying to address them in a realistic way. So thanks for the opportunity to share some of our thinking with you.
If we can launch the poll now, just so we can get people to feedback to us, and we're real time. We want to evaluate how helpful or not this has been. So thank you everyone, and thanks so much to our panelists. I really love that we were able to bring so many different geographical examples as well to this And great, back to Social Value UK.
Yes, and Social Fund on behalf of Social Value International and Social Value UK, thank you for an incredible session and great speakers. It's been really, really insightful. And this session has been recorded, and the recording will be available for replay for those who have bought the tickets for full access. The next session we got on today is localizing impact measurement and management approaches from a South African perspective. That is starting in 14 minutes. So we hope to see you there as well. And I will now show you the result from the poll, which shows that people can see immediate connections, 71%. So that's some good news.
Great, thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.